Good evening. We just brought our panel up to the front, so we've got 5 empty chairs up here. So 5 people who are standing in the back there, please, you are most welcome right here, and we won't make you come up. 6 at least, so please come take these chairs. Welcome on this fine February evening. My name is Cheryl Pauls, and I serve as president of Canadian Mennonite University. And I'm delighted to be joined by all of you here this evening to talk about death, which we claim won't kill you, whether you're here in this room or joining us through live streaming. CMU, as a university rooted in the Anabaptist faith tradition, lives and learns in times and on lands entrusted by God to human creatures and indeed to all living things. And we commit to honoring the people who have stewarded these lands since times long past as the homelands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples and the Métis Nation. We're grateful for the generous welcome of the Selkirk-Peguis Treaty of 1817, where this area was designated as River Lots 18, 19, and 20, and for the Covenant of Treaty 1 of 1871 as signed before Creator by Indigenous First Nations and recent immigrant and settler peoples. We're grateful also for Treaty 3, the source of our clear, clean drinking water. Now, Face2Face extends CMU's core mandate of teaching, research, and service. You know, people who aren't students often ask me how they can participate in the kinds of learning that happens through classes at CMU. Now, of course, you'd expect to say, well, why not take a class? At the same time, I'm pleased that we can extend something of the classroom through Face2Face, and particularly the format of a panel of presenters who are not chosen to represent left and right positions, but instead invited to speak from their various starting places of vocation and life experience, and seeing what happens as the conversation unfolds. At this time, please join me in welcoming David Baltzer, CMU Assistant Professor of Communications and Media Studies, who will facilitate this evening's conversation and introduce this fine panel. Thank you. And David, please.
Well, good evening. I feel very privileged to have interacted with our panelists and heard some of their stories, and I'm really excited that we get to share those stories with you this evening. A few words of opening and just setting the context, and then we'll move right into our conversation and hear from our panelists, and then the Q&A. Not all conversations, I suggest, carry this kind of import as tonight. Tonight's conversation really is a matter of life and death. That's probably the only semi-bad joke I'll tell tonight. I just thought I had to get one in there. The other thing is I've noticed that this must be the right place for this conversation because people did start coming about an hour and a half early, which feels like the funeral tradition in some quarters to come early. So I think we're well prepared for this tonight. We have this strange dynamic, I suggest. Looking at pop culture, we see this fascination, even an obsession with death, and yet our everyday experience points to a fear and discomfort at times when it comes to speaking about our mortality. So let's talk about death. We're very grateful for this group of panelists who have agreed to share their stories so that we can talk well together. I want to introduce something we're trying for the first time tonight, and that is an online tool that we would like to experiment with. And if we can go to that slide, we will have you try that right now. If you go to slido.com or sli.do, if you have your mobile device with you, about 80% of Canadians own them these days. All you need to do is enter, when you get to that homepage, just enter the keyword death, no surprise there, as our event code for this evening. And I invite you to participate in this opening poll. What is the first word that comes to mind when someone says the word death? Go ahead, and if you're on your devices, just enter that keyword, the keyword death, to enter the poll, and then we'll see what your reactions are. What comes to mind? There is a CMU wireless. The code is not in my memory at this moment. Wireless at, the symbol at, CMU, exclamation mark. So if you figure that out by the end of the evening, you'll be able to join us. All right, so we'll just let those words scroll there for a moment as I make a few comments. And later on in the evening, we're going to use the same interactive tool where you can submit questions to the panel, and I'll explain that when we get to that stage in the evening. When it comes to the aim of this evening, I'm simply going to restate what Jen Zarate said, I believe, so well in her Saturday Winnipeg Free Press column about this event. She says the following: as humans, we tend to focus on what it means to have good life, but it's equally important to think about what it means to have a good death. And we can't do that without talking about it first. I'd like to turn now to just introduce our panelists, and then we will hear their stories. Rick Zerbe Cornelsen, right to my left, your right here, is an urn and casket maker working out of a small shop just behind his home. As he describes it, since 2004, he's offered people a chance to be buried or to bury their loved one in something that is beautiful, sensible, and built by someone whose name and face they can know if they choose. Rick's father, now almost 100 years old, was a master woodworker in post-war Germany who brought his lathe and young family to Canada in 1956. Rick has degrees in sociology and theology. He's been married to Dory Zerbe Cornelsen for 36 years and is the proud father of 2 adult children and a brother to 4 older siblings. One of his hobbies includes denying death, or at least physical decline, by continuing to play indoor soccer. Doug Koop is beside him. Doug comes close to countless individuals and their families in his work as a spiritual health practitioner at the Health Sciences Center in Winnipeg. Accompanying death is almost a daily experience for him, and he's been coming alongside of people in medically distressing situations since 2013. As a freelance writer whose work appears in both faith-based and mainstream publications, he spent 25 years previously, before this next part of his calling, covering Christian faith in Canada as a reporter and editor of the Christian Week family of newspapers. Beside him is Angelika Jantz. She is the mother of 2 sons and comes from a family of 1 brother and 6 sisters. She and her siblings are orphans since the death of her mother, Catherine, in May of 2017. Their father, Hugo, died in August of 2006. Angelika and her husband, Walter Nickel, live outside Winnipeg on the LaSalle River, where wide open prairie and riverbank forest meet. Here she endeavors to cultivate a new rhythm and perspective since retiring from the profession of social work a year and a half ago. And on the far end is Michael Boyce. He's Associate Professor of English and Film Studies at Booth University College. Michael is Associate Professor and teaches many courses, and currently as well is serving as the Vice President Academic and Dean. His teaching covers a selection of literature and film courses, including British film, religion and pop culture, fantasy literature, television, film adaptation, film genre, and popular culture. He writes, speaks, and tweets about literature, film, TV, comics, and popular culture. We've asked each of our panelists to reflect on their experience and to glean from that some of their learnings, and we'll turn to that now. So Rick, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, David. Excuse me. I saw a mock TV commercial recently. It shows women in public spaces getting unwanted attention from men. The women pull out a handy device called the Leave Me Alone. It's a fake cremation urn. They pretend that they are about to scatter the ashes of their loved one, and invariably the men flee. The sketch is funny, I think, because the average viewer agrees with the men that being around death is unpleasant. It repels us because we fear it. I have certainly carried that fear for most or all of my life. Not only fear of my own death, but fear of being around those who are dying or grieving. It's probably why the idea of being a casket maker always intrigued me. It was when I was only 8 or 10 that I heard older family members half joking about starting such a business. They had heard from a friend that caskets at the funeral home were extravagant and expensive. They wanted to bypass that system and get a piece of that action. Somehow as a kid, I knew that this conversation was just a bit edgy. Death was supposed to be left to those dark-suited professionals. And challenging their monopoly on casket sales seemed a bit subversive. The idea lingered into my adulthood. It proved useful at boring parties. But it really gained traction when my father built his and hers caskets, and then some years later we buried my mother in one of them. The consolation we felt as a family was real. And I began to wonder whether local, small-scale casket production could be one part of a broader change in how we care for the dead. Despite our instinct to flee from the process, there's also a fairly widespread urge to bring it a bit closer to home. So about 15 years ago, I hung out my shingle as the village casket maker. And as you already heard, I work in a small shop behind my home. Although I do sell directly to families, they typically still use a conventional funeral home for other services. So the process represents a small detour outside of the mainstream system. And yet, the process is meaningful to me, and seems to be for some of the people who come to my shop. What I love about it, firstly, is making things that become part of someone else's story. I've had an Indigenous artist spend a day in my shop painting designs on a loved one's casket. I've had children decorating the underside of their grandmother's casket lid. But what I love at least as much as the craft is the quality of the encounters that I have with people in my shop. They inspire me. Let's face it, if there's one thing that being around death does, it's that it strips away many of our pretenses. It's hard to discuss the weight limitations of a casket or the internal capacity of an urn while pretending that everything's fine or it's all good. Sometimes when a stranger enters my shop, all it takes is a glance or a greeting to acknowledge that we're all in this together. But often, with the smell of freshly cut wood in the air, people choose to tell me their stories, and good things seem to happen. A few weeks ago, I had in my shop the family of a woman who had died the night before. At one point, they began recounting the very moment at which she had stopped breathing. At first, they were telling me the story, but then I noticed them testing their memories with each other and confirming for each other that that mystery-filled moment had indeed taken place. There was a kind of intimacy to their storytelling that might have seemed out of place, were it not for the presence, so to speak, of a very recent death. Another time, a man came to the shop with his 2 middle-aged sons. After some conversation about his beloved wife who had just died, the man and one of his sons told me about their successful careers. When I engaged the other son, he was reticent and more self-deprecating. At some point, the father jumped in and in a warm and loving way told me about that second son's good character and his accomplishments. My impression was that that father-son blessing might not have happened if all 3 men hadn't been just a little tipsy with grief. And sometimes my visitors are shopping for themselves. It's hard to imagine a more authentic or courageous activity. Last year, a gentleman made his way in from his wife's car and sat down on my only dusty chair. He told me as he labored for breath about all the grain elevators he'd built across the prairies. And then for fun, he quizzed me about my knowledge of wood species, something about which he knew a lot. Although I'm pretty sure I failed his quiz, what seemed to be most important to him was that his future casket maker would know about the grain elevators. He left again, assisted by his wife, looking satisfied that he had crossed off another item from his list. And finally, quite long ago now, a delightful and very elderly woman ordered a custom casket for herself to be stored by her friend until needed. She wanted that classic coffin shape with the broad shoulders and narrow at the toes, like in the old country. When she arrived at my shop to collect it, not only did she insist on paying in cash, like in the old country, but she first insisted on climbing inside the casket to give it a test drive, much to the amusement of her son, although he didn't seem that surprised. Now, that woman was naturally unguarded and unpretentious. But the point of my vignettes is that most of us need a little help getting there. So when the reality of death forces us to let down our guards, that truly difficult and usually unwelcome thing is also providing us with an opportunity. I don't mean that any particular death should be celebrated because it's doing us a favor. I mean that when death inevitably shows up around us, facing it together is better than fleeing from it. Doing so gives us a taste of what it's like to live more openly and honestly, something then that we can then try to replicate during the ordinary times of life. Thank you for listening to me, and for the same reasons that I love my work, I now look forward to listening to the friends beside me and to all of you.
My experience with dying people began rather late in life when, as a 49-year-old, I was with my wife's family for the final days of her 92-year-old father. That was my first real encounter with a deathbed. For the past 5 years, however, I've been up close and personal with hundreds of people in end-of-life care. And death is never easy, yet it often turns out to be a very precious, a sacred time. The terrible privilege of being present at the portal. Death is a very large black hole of a topic, so I'm going to confine myself to 3 general observations and hopefully get more specific in the questions and discussion. The first is to state the obvious, the material reality of death. Human bodies do not live forever. They wear out, they break, they get broken. And death comes in many forms, and it can come at any age. Yet one thing we can be sure, come it does. No matter who we are, flesh inevitably fails. Breathing stops, blood ceases to circulate, cell regeneration diminishes and disappears, decay takes over. Life as we know it is gone. The person we knew is removed from the immediate environment. And this is the way it's been through all the generations of human history. We're born, we live, we die, and death is no respecter of persons. It is unavoidable. It's the great leveler. Bodily death is a fact of life. Now, death happens to individuals, but it affects communities. It has a social impact. Friends and family members may well be exposed to the process of dying, and this can be uncomfortable, disconcerting at many levels. And today, some medical practices pay as much attention to the comfort of the attending families as to the person who's making the actual passage. It speaks to our discomfort with the material realities of death. A corpse, on the other hand, does not feel pain, or at any rate never complains about it. The poet and undertaker Thomas Lynch often observes how the dead don't care. He sees enormous value in funerals and maintains that the purpose of a good funeral is to get the dead body where it needs to go and to get the living where they need to be. The funeral is important, he says, not because it matters to the dead, but because the dead matter to the living. Now, people experience many emotions in the face of death, and this will often be fear. Death seems to provide a liberation of sorts, bringing a final release to the one suffering its discomforts. Inevitably, it's a release from the limitations of the human body. This life is over. It's done for the deceased. But the lingering effects of any death impact other living beings, the person's family, friends, and associates. It dramatically and irrevocably changes the nature of the relationship that existed. The relationship itself does continue, but it is very different. It carries on in memories and sometimes in dreams. It shows up in tears unbidden or sudden laughter. Grief can bring moments of wrenching sadness or a sense of sublime connection, or both, maybe even at the same time. As a spiritual health practitioner, my conversations often deal with the mystery of what happens to people after they die. The great beyond, a realm where religion often plays a deciding role. Most people understand that the body itself, that material thing that disappears into dust or some other organic compound, was only a carrying vessel for the individual who once dealt within it. The personality was always something greater than the container. And it's human nature to be curious or vexed about what comes next. And as I see it, there are 4 options. After a body dies, the human body, or the human spirit, might experience something good, or something bad, or nothing at all, or come back and do it all over again. And if there are other options, I'd be pleased to learn of them. And whichever way we lean on that question is a matter of opinion rather than of actual knowledge. It's a belief held by faith. And each of us will hold our opinions about the soul's existence after bodily death with varying degrees of certitude or confidence or indifference. The fact remains, we don't know. The soul's destiny is a sublime mystery, and unless the pure materialists turn out to be right, we'll all find out someday. Religious faith can either help or inhibit a good death. At its best, it provides a contented confidence in the spirit. And yet, doubts and fears are more apt to rise among devoted believers than they are in the general populace. A religious devout who considers his or her own behavior in the light of the perfection they believe the Holy One demands is in a scary place. The gap separating personal conduct from holy expectations yawns wide for many, raising a specter of judgment that pushes infinite grace to the periphery. Their big inner critic rings loud, and they actually experience higher levels of guilt, fear, and regret at the end of life than those whose belief systems are held less rigorously. At the same time, good religion provides excellent formation for a good death. Religious faith can be a great asset in facing the stark reality that any one of our lives is but a brief flicker in the context of the universe and eternity. A grace-imbued belief system that's been confidently embraced will calm and settle a soul getting ready to take flight. So to wrap up, death is inevitable and generally uncomfortable. Death happens to individuals, but those left behind, and that's each of us so far, feels its impact. And what happens to any individual after death remains a compelling mystery. And I'm going to welcome any further discussion about any of this. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to say a few things that are going to sound a lot like what they just said. So I just want to thank you for inviting me. And I'm impressed with how this room gets used for such great conversations and bringing people together. It's really great. So it's a good question. What draws me to the idea of death in general and to death cafes in particular? Maybe it is my melancholic nature. No matter how restless I get, I always know that there is value in stillness and in darkness and even in sadness. Or maybe it's because I had a father who talked a lot about death being the beginning of an unimaginable and wonderful adventure. And he also reveled in the logistics of death. He would love to remind us of where his will was as he was on his way somewhere, and what songs to sing at his funeral. But I'm also profoundly aware of the alienation and rootlessness that I sometimes feel in the life that I live and in the culture that I live in. That with all its talk and emphasis on self-reliance and self-achievement, has actually very little to teach us about what it means to be human and what being human requires of us in these days, about how to live, about how to die, and how to take our place in the natural world, in the larger story that is very, very old and that will continue long after our life ends. I want to read a quote from a book by Barbara Ehrenreich, her book Natural Causes. She says, "You can think of death bitterly or with resignation as a tragic interruption of your life and take every possible measure to postpone it. Or more realistically, you can think of life as an interruption of an eternity of personal non-existence and seize it as a brief opportunity to observe and interact with the living, ever-surprising world around us." End quote. So it is a good way to orientate ourselves, I think, to find a direction forward when we remember our minute place in a very large cosmos, that we as humans are just a small part of this cosmos and interconnected with every other part. The natural world teaches us that death and life are inextricably linked, and it seems to me that this can give way to a sense of freedom as we accept our finiteness in the context of something much bigger than ourselves. And as death frames and limits our existence, it can also influence and sometimes deepen our perspective on living. It also seems to me that an acceptance of death as inevitable and natural allows us to recognize our common humanity and provides a reference point for how we can live together. As I mentioned earlier, my observation is that there is a lot of emphasis in our culture on self-improvement and individual well-being. If we just do all the right things, eat the right food, adopt the right habits and thinking, then surely we will have strong bodies and minds, and we will live a very long life. And billions of dollars are made to help us towards that end. From this perspective, we see death as defeat, as the result of a person's poor choices or bad luck. It is interesting to consider the implications of that emphasis on how we live and what kind of society we have, and to wonder, how would it be if we remembered that aging and dying is a natural part of being human and something we all have in common? And what if we lived knowing that our well-being is much more impacted by societal factors than individual behaviors, and that our striving only for self-improvement and recovery does little to change that culture around us into one that is truly sustaining of our humanity? I wonder if this shift would find us creating a different kind of world, find us cultivating a different kind of relationship with each other and the natural world around us. These are some of the things that we talk about in death cafes. The idea of a death cafe was taken up in London, England in 2011 by John Underwood, who himself was inspired by the work of Bernard Kretaz, a Swiss sociologist. Since 2014, there have been various people organizing death cafes here and in and around Winnipeg. Death cafes are a social franchise. Anyone is able to organize a death cafe, but there is a guide available online that helps you to stay true to the vision and principles. And they are simple. The objective is to increase awareness of death with a view to helping people make the most of their finite life. The guidelines are, first, that the death cafe be held in an accessible, comfortable, respectful place. Second, that the death cafe be offered on a not-for-profit basis. Thirdly, that there is no intention or attempt to influence thoughts or to sell any products or course of action. And fourthly, that good coffee and tea is served with cake. I have never been part of organizing a death cafe, but I have had the privilege of attending several over the years. A death cafe is a place where you are free to talk about any aspect of death. My experience with death cafes is that it attracts the kind of people and creates the kind of environment that allows strangers to talk with each other about what is most important to them, and with an openness that is sometimes hard to find even with people we know very well. Death is a great equalizer, and we quickly discover our shared humanity and fragility. It was in part due to these conversations I had at Death Cafe that I started thinking more about the skills and resources required to respond to people in their dying and death, and how we can cultivate these in ourselves and in our community. This is something we used to know how to do. Death care was once provided by family or the community, but we have largely handed it over to the medical system or the funeral industry. These days, and for a variety of reasons, there is a renewed and growing interest in doing things differently. There are people training to be death doulas, home funeral advocates, and others working on making green burial an option even for us here in Winnipeg. There's also a Facebook group for those who are on Facebook called Death Care Manitoba, which gives a lot of information about alternative ways of working at things. So when my mother was approaching her death in May of 2017, the stars aligned in a way that made it possible for us as a family to try to put some of these ideas into practice. I was not the only one in our family who was thinking about and researching alternative death care. And then just before her death, there was a PBS film called A Family Undertaking, which was shown here in Winnipeg, and a number of my siblings attended. We'd also had the good fortune of meeting some key people that provided the kind of practical and emotional support that we needed. These people were Jackie Avent, who's here with us today, Shane Neufeld from Integrity Death Care, and Rick. There were some factors we had to plan around, so Shane arranged for my mom's body to be moved from her room at Bethania Personal Care Home to a cool room for 3 days. He then brought her to my sister Carol's home, where we spent 2 days and a night together. Jackie provided a lot of support to us during that time. We cleaned our mom and dressed her and covered her with our grandmother's Afghan. Then we cleaned the house and made food and invited her friends and family and church. And they came over for coffee. People were free to spend some time in the sunroom where she was lying, or just have coffee and visit. Several people remarked that this is the way things used to be, that the family would care for the body, and it seemed to me there was a warmth in the memory of that. For me and my siblings, it allowed us to let go of our mom more slowly and hold on to her until she was in the ground. And at the cemetery, we also asked that we be allowed to help cover the coffin, which is usually something that is done once the family leaves. We found it a rich experience to tend to her after her death, and it was comforting and empowering to be involved in this way.
Recently, a friend of mine told me a story. She'd been asked to conduct a memorial service for someone, not uncommon in her profession. When she met with the family to try to work out the details of the memorial service, she sat down with members of the family. The man's son and daughter were adamant that this be a celebration of his life with as little religious content as possible. Dad didn't like God stuff, they said. Then she sat down with the man's brothers and sisters, who insisted that the service reflect their proud Catholic heritage. I tell this story because it's about two conflicting narratives that exist. In their 1987 article, Death and Society in the 20th Century, Robert Fulton and Greg Owens observed that most of us, they were talking about Americans, I think it applies to Canadians, lack firsthand experience with death and dying. Compared to a few generations ago, the lower infant mortality rate, our elderly and ill are removed to personal care homes and put in the care of professionals. Even our food lacks that connection with death. As a result, death and dying has become abstract and invisible. We all know Benjamin Franklin's famous axiom, there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. We don't like to talk about money either. Our language has softened, and for many, words like dead, dying, died are verboten. They're taboo. We've softened our words, and not doing well, we're failing and expired to the, we talk about people not doing well, of failing, of having expired or passed away, to the point that conversations can be happening about dying and people outside might not even know what's being discussed. Similarly, we've seen the gradual disappearance of commonly understood ritualized expressions of grief and loss. Such changes, I suppose, are inevitable. After all, in Victorian society, they would honor their dead by dressing them up and taking family photos with them. I'm sure that practice would not go over well today. My purpose for being here is to talk about the ways in which narratives about death continue to exist in popular culture and the popularity of these narratives in popular culture. As Keith Durkin observes, despite our death-denying tendencies, our fears of death, we remain fascinated by narratives and representations of death, dying, grief, and loss. Popular culture is full of them. In a conversation I had earlier today, I was talking about just the different types of narratives that are being told. Stories that are both examining the loss of someone dying, but also speculation about the afterlife. And I find it very interesting and fascinating and definitely open for conversations afterwards, if we can start to pull apart what it is behind those narratives. Why are people interested in shows like The Good Place, speculating about the afterlife and what comes next, while at the same time, in our regular everyday life, are terrified to talk about dying and death? We see the popularity of hospital dramas, Grey's Anatomy and others, police procedurals, which emphasize the end of life, the cadaver as the central narrative of the story. Right now, we are in a very interesting time in popular culture where comics and television shows and movies are dealing with these issues in ways that open up the possibility of conversation. And I wanted to end with another story. A couple of months ago, my church does a film night, and we recently watched an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I can see from the looks on your face, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a show, very supernatural in nature, about a young girl who fights vampires. But there's an episode called The Body, which if you know the show, you're nodding your head now, in which the main character's mother dies of a brain aneurysm. Nothing supernatural, nothing even heroic about the death. Just a regular, ordinary death. And the way in which the show handles grief was such an interesting topic for conversation in a church community. It was fascinating how people realized the ways in which a show that can treat death quite trivially, I said that word right, can make the death of one character so impactful, so meaningful, by little things, making us uncomfortable. Discomfort is not a bad thing. So in the show, for example, they take out any score. When suddenly you don't hear music and you're used to it, you feel uncomfortable. And just the long shots of the body and the regular, routine procedures that follow when somebody dies. It was a fascinating look and an ability to open up, it created the ability to open up a conversation amongst the community. So I look forward to more conversation about this. Thank you.
So So now we want to turn the conversation over to you, and if you would like to submit a question through the Slido tool, then you can go to Slido, and there should be a tab there where you can just text in your question, and I will be just monitoring them here and feeding them to the panel. So if you're watching through live stream as well, if you want to go to slido.com and enter the keyword death, and then that will give you right access to our event and invite you to do that. Depending on how many questions we get online, there is a feature as well that you can upvote the question you would like answered. So those of you that enjoy Reddit, we won't go into all of the philosophical reasons why upvoting questions is a good or a bad idea, but if we get a lot of questions and you say, I really wanted to hear about this question, then go ahead and vote the one up that you'd like to hear, and then we'll take note of that. The microphones are available here. This is not just a online on your device. I know it's counterintuitive. Everyone look at your device while we're face-to-face. But the microphones are here available, and also there will be a roving mic in the back. So please, the floor is yours. Take advantage of this remarkable panel to have a conversation that perhaps you haven't had and you've been wanting to have. So I will wait for the first question. And we're also inviting the panelists to ask questions of each other if they would like. Who would like to begin? Go ahead. So the question is to you, Rick. I get a coffin, and then what do I do? That could go in a lot of directions.
I think I'll just answer this real straight. Typically what happens, if we're just talking about the mechanics of the process, if a family is interested in having a casket that I've made, usually they may call me ahead or even visit ahead and consider the options, but usually then when the loved one has died, they will call me, perhaps come to the shop, decide on which one, and then either I will deliver it to their funeral home of choice, or they will put it in their van or their pickup truck or their SUV with the door barely shutting and take it themselves. And I'm talking about the typical situation. If there are some situations where it's not going to a conventional funeral home, but in most cases, that's how it works. Are there other options, you mean, for the other kinds of services that you might need around caring for the body? I mean, there's no other one-stop type shop, but there are options that perhaps Angelika can even speak to. You can do some things yourself, and I think there are a range of possibilities there. I believe you mentioned death doulas and so on that might assist in the process.
Jackie, do you have anything that you can say about that, or should I just refer people to the community death care?
Thank you.
I had the great privilege of working with Angelika and her family when their mom, Catherine, died. And that was based on some training that I'll just go over here so that I'm not in the middle of the room. But based on training that I had received through an online course called the Beyond Yonder School of Community Death Care. And as part of that course, we learned a variety of things from what to do when somebody dies and the legal things that can take place in Manitoba to information about how to care for a body at home. So my understanding in Manitoba, the body is the legal property of the family of the decedent. So If the person has died of natural causes at home, there's really no reason that that body can't stay at home and be cared for up to 72 hours by the family. But there are recommendations of ways to keep the body cool, to care for that body in that place. In the case of Catherine, she died in a care facility, and the family would have legally been allowed to transport her body, provided it was in an appropriate container, which leak-proof is the type of container. And I think a coffin, might be able to speak to this more, Rick, but would your coffin be considered leak-proof, or would it need a liner in it?
Some are and some aren't, so it's, my designs vary in that regard.
Okay. So again, finding out information and being informed as you're making your preparations in advance. So there are, if the person has died and requires an autopsy, I'm not sure necessarily about if that person could be then brought home. I think there might be other things to consider if there were large openings in the body. So I hope that answers some questions, but I can speak more. Thanks.
I'm going to go to the online questions as well, and there's two themes that are emerging there. One is kind of the mechanics of death and dying, and the other are the impact on us as a community. So I'm going to try to just cast those to various panel members here. And the upvoting is working. So the community in Saskatoon that's watching via live stream, they have all voted their question to the top. So, so that works. If you're all in the same room together, they're sending their greetings to us. 22 people gathered at Wildwood Mennonite Church in Saskatoon that are joining us via live stream. They didn't actually ask a question. They just voted that statement up to the top. So they're happy to be joining us. So that's wonderful. So welcome. I'm sure they're responding with questions as well. There's a number, and I'll just turn briefly to you, Rick, and then go to the other panelists as well. There's a number of questions around going green. And I wonder if any of you have a response to that. Are caskets that are green or even a green burial available in Manitoba, and where is that in the mix of things? So that's more of a mechanics kind of question. Who would like to respond to that?
Well, I'll start, if that's okay. I do have one casket that has no glue, no metal. It's just softwood, and it would, I think, qualify under any criteria as a green burial container. But I am not aware of any cemeteries that have what would be called a truly green cemetery. But perhaps others of you know more about that.
I just know that there are some people like Jackie again and Yvonne Block that are currently working on a green burial option for us here in Winnipeg.
I'll go to the next question, and if somebody has insight, the community can respond to that. Is there a difference between how the young and the old are talking about death? Has that changed over time? So a generational question. Go
Well,
ahead,
in my
Michael.
research, I did come across young people taking selfies with dead relatives and posting them on social media. And it was very interesting to read the comments on those. Most people were aghast and very critical about respect. But again, like, go back to the Victorian death photos. Like, is that a new way of expressing grief and loss, that it doesn't necessarily mean it is a flippant act by the young people? I think young people especially, are struggling more with finding the language to talk about death and ways of expressing grief and loss.
So if we had somebody at a funeral in our community, somebody at a viewing say, pose and take a selfie at the front,
Yeah.
that probably would feel disruptive in
Yes.
some way
Sure.
at this point. But
Yeah.
you're suggesting that may not, like, why not?
Yes. Why not?
I'd just like to do a follow-up on that one. My family history, and I'm wondering if it's many people in the room, there's tons of pictures from the 50s through about until the early 90s of family members next to the casket. And it's only since about 1990 that I haven't seen that happening as much. So I'm wondering if there are people here who could comment on some change in their family practice. Like, I'm really curious on why that changed at about that time.
Go ahead and pull out your family photo albums, and we'll pass them around as we have conversation. I'll just add another question for you, Michael, and then the question also is, are there other narratives from film that you would recommend or suggest that are creating interesting conversation or have the possibility of conversation around these issues?
Yes. Give me a minute.
So think about that
I'll
one.
think about that.
Other questions from the floor? I'm just looking at, there we go. Go ahead.
Hello. Whoa, that's very loud. The sense I'm getting from this conversation is that the ability to feel funny about talking about death is a stance of privilege. My refugee clients talk about death a lot. I think there's a lot of Indigenous communities in which this conversation comes up a lot more. I'm wondering if any of you had an opportunity to reflect on that or any thoughts on that.
Well, I do think that our culture is unique in how it wants to avoid discussion about death and see it as sort of a failure as opposed to a natural part of life. I think Indigenous cultures and African, possibly, I spent a little bit of time in Africa. My sense was that people, maybe because they didn't have the same illusion of control, of being in control, just knew that death was a part of life, and it didn't surprise them so much, and they had really good rituals around it to help move grief in a good direction.
Yeah, when death is near or deemed to be near in some way, then we talk about it. There are some cases where the elephant in the room is sublimely ignored, but by and large, certainly in the context in which I work, we talk about death a lot, and that's often a welcome thing. I'm remembering one patient in particular who had a number of issues and clearly was getting near the end of life. It wasn't like tomorrow or next week, but it wasn't that much further down the road. But she didn't really know that. And she was frustrated. She was causing a lot of trouble for the medical team, and they were tiptoeing around her. And as she was venting some of this to me one day, I asked her, so she felt she didn't know what was going on. And I asked her, so point blank, did you want to talk about death? Yes, at last, somebody, here it is. So in other cultures and less privileged societies, we don't have the luxury of putting away that conversation. It's in our face. It's a bigger part of the present in our lives, and that goes some way towards explaining that dynamic.
Doug, I want to follow up with a question here as well that I think may relate to your experience in particular. How does Canada's change of laws and the legalization of MAID change our conversations of death and dying? It's early on. Has it shifted in some way?
Yeah, I think it caters to the autonomous nature that is big in our society, is that we value individual autonomy above collective sort of expressions. and it's part of it is control. So people who are seeking a medically assisted death are exerting some element of control over the way that they die. They know they're going to die. They want it to be done peacefully. They don't want to go through a whole bunch of things. There's certain things they want to avoid, but there's certain things they want to have, and that is the say. They want an element of control. And there are patients who actually qualify for MAID and are accepted into the program who never use it. They are more at peace simply knowing that they got that card in their pocket if ever they want to play it.
Does that somehow fly a little bit in the face of kind of the disposition of a variety of your stories, was that it's exactly the control that's kind of getting in the way of what is a very natural experience? Any comment on that? Is what some of your experiences tell you that maybe we should let go rather than try to take it back?
Well, ideally, I mean, in my opinion, yeah, that we should be acknowledging the communal aspect of it. We should have a more open posture towards death and ordinary discourse. There's death. Talk about death brings people together. I mean, it's a huge bonding agent, and that's a good thing for a community. So yeah, I think in some ways that's driving the wrong direction. On the other hand, it is the process of dying is rarely comfortable, and it can be downright ugly, and it's certainly very hard. It can be wrenching. It isn't always. So the people do not want that, and so the prospect of being able to go out in a way that you know you're not going to feel any pain is very enticing.
Let's go to the floor here.
Yes, we've all been at funerals where the people try to avoid the fact that this was a sad occasion. We avoid crying, we avoid mourning. Traditional societies had professional mourners that would provide that. I've been at a Hutterite funeral, and there was a wake the night before the actual funeral, and people just sat around singing songs and reminiscing. I've requested actually that for my funeral. And then the next day was a celebration, this sense of thankfulness that came from the life. I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on how we can make funerals and wakes more meaningful. Because often there's a denial of death. Sometimes there is a sense, well, they're all gone to a better place anyway. It's happy occasion. I'm not comfortable with either of those approaches.
Well, I'll start an answer. One thing is in the society is the trend away from even a funeral of any sort, and it's again usually stated as per so-and-so's request, there will be no funeral, and we might do something later on at some point. So how do we make funerals better? I mean, it's a good thing. The notion, even before that sort of not having anything, the language changed to, it wasn't the funeral, it was a celebration of life. Mm-hmm. And we do that. But the grieving process requires that we face the pain, that we look hard into the loss that is right there before us, and that we shed those tears, or that we rage against the heavens, or do whatever it is that we do to let those emotions that are inside, give them some vent, and we need some place to do that. So, I mean, it happens certainly in the context of the room where people are dying, and some of that needs to get transferred to the funeral, so that the stories are real, the tears are real, the laughter, all those things intermix. And that's, I think, a good funeral will have a healthy blend of things from the tradition that the person followed, it doesn't deny, it doesn't highlight either their shortcomings or whatever. It realizes that life is a bittersweet thing with an intriguing blend of good, bad, ugly, and beautiful. And we need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, one thing that occurs to me is how, we have grief counselors or grief programs, and those are good and helpful in many ways, but it does make you wonder if, as we've been unable to do it more naturally, we've started to look to professionals to teach us how to grieve, as opposed to learning how to do that ourselves and within our communities.
Did you want to respond, Rick? Go ahead.
Could. And I wonder if this also even comes back to what Cheryl asked us earlier about how things have changed in the last 20 years or so. I wonder how important it is to have the body present in the course of a funeral. I know the conference that's starting here tonight or tomorrow is going to look at that question, as whether the body is an important part of the funeral. And so taking pictures with the casket or the body is not possible if there is no casket or body. And so that may be one reason why we're not seeing those photos as much anymore.
Rick, just one of the questions that's risen up the list here, and thanks for contributing. There's lots of incredible questions here for us to respond to. Cremation, 25 years ago, this person is suggesting, was taboo, had a taboo sense around it. Now it's quite commonplace. And do you want to say anything more about, maybe weigh in on that question of the presence of the body or not?
I think there are some good reasons, especially if the body has not been deteriorating before our eyes for a long time, to have the body present in some way as a way of acknowledging the reality of that death. I know that when my mother died, we had her body present at the funeral, but not with a viewing, and I in fact did not see her body after she had died. Because partly of her own wish. But it also felt less necessary because we had watched her die already for months and felt that the reality was clear. But if it were a sudden death, I think it might be different if you wanted to really bring home the reality of the death.
Let's go to the floor and then I'll go back.
My name is Tom Chan. I'm about to peel an onion. In a hypothetical, normal, natural way of life, the life cycle, we see a lot of our friends, siblings, spouse, grandparents, uncles, and aunts, they passed away. But it becomes a difficult layer to peel when one loses a child. And it is a deeper and more bitter layer to peel when a child takes his own life. To this day, I still have difficulty dealing with my own feelings.
He was a young man I admired very much. And it was a real kick to my gut when he died. And I can only imagine what it does to a father. Thanks, Tom.
extending that question a bit further, one of the responses here is to ask about how we come alongside of children who are grieving as well. We often think about adults in this process of being in that, and I think about a family around a sibling. How do we come alongside of each other as children in a very different space? Go ahead, Angelika.
I mean, I think, Tom, it's really good to see you. And I thought about that a little bit when I was writing what I wrote here. It sounds a little cavalier, I know, when compared to losing a child. And I don't know if I have any answers to that. I think in some ways, though, it goes back to some of the things we've been saying, that because we are so removed from death so much of the time when it happens, and especially when it happens in such a shocking way, it's so hard to find the resources to deal with that. I think sometimes churches or groups or families help with that, but it doesn't ease it very much sometimes. I don't know.
Children need to be part of it in age-appropriate ways. I know it's a conversation that comes up when you have someone dying, and shall we bring in the kids, or, and depending on the level of relationship, that question will come up and the age of them. And I listen to these conversations as people have them among themselves, and if and when they ask for an opinion, I lean in the direction of full acknowledgement. I think the children, if they are appropriately supported, can bear whatever it is they need to see. But there's great fears can arise when you are just kept away from something that you know is too terrible for you to look at. Then it just grows in the imagination. So there are things you wish nobody would ever see, let alone children. But by and large, I think some knowledge and proper support is what children need, and this is part of creating community and making it not that scary thing we don't talk about. It's part of our life.
There's a couple questions here that are asking, how do you navigate when the interests of a family or of the person who's died is different than the interests of the family who's now wanting to memorialize or celebrate? And I wonder, Rick, if you've encountered a few conversations in your shop even in that regard, and how do you wade into that? That's just one scenario, but the question also is the larger one of creating, how do we open conversation? Another question is, how do we as a family have conversation about caring or talking about a loved one and inviting a natural death or planning for end of life rather than saying we want to be intervening? So again, these enormous questions that families who are living are trying to sort out, be it the wishes of somebody who's passed away or the wishes of somebody who's alive. And the community, I think, Doug, as you mentioned, they're trying to figure this out. So Rick, start maybe in your shop, and then we'll move it forward.
I have numerous times had people in the shop telling me directly that the loved one who just died, usually it's dad, he just wanted a pine box. But we know that Aunt so-and-so would not stand for that, and so we have to, get your next up in the line or something like that. And that's a recognition that I think Doug or someone said that you know, the funeral is really for the living and not so much for the dead. So that's probably not a bad way to cheat. I've sometimes had families in my shop where there is conflict right within the room. And usually it's about the question of whether my caskets are good looking enough for their loved one or for their community. And I've probably lost a few sales because I've advised people right there that, you know, this probably doesn't matter enough for you. Even the one who wants to do what I think is the right thing, the simpler funeral and so on, I might suggest to them that, you know what, this actually doesn't matter as much as family harmony and just getting through this. And so, yeah, it's real, but...
So is there wisdom in counseling to say, let the living decide without guilt, even if it goes against the wishes that were quite adamantly stated in documents or otherwise about the nature of the casket?
When I referred to the guy who just wanted a pine box, I don't know how adamantly it was stated and how formally or whatever. But I do think that even when we're talking about what makes for a good funeral, I don't think there's one answer where, you know, if you follow these things, then it's going to be good. And that ultimately means if you have to give a little bit on your ideals here, it's partly about together getting through this. And so, yeah, I don't think you have to stick to one program.
I'm going to just hold the question here. Somebody's been waiting in the back, but we will get to right away. Go ahead.
Well, I guess this is a good time to talk about this. We're just talking about it. When my mother was 91, and we knew she was passing away because the home had phoned and said, your mother will be leaving us. And so what we did is we had all of the grandchildren come, and each of the grandchildren had 15 minutes to talk with Grandma about her life and about leaving and about where she would be going and things like that. And it turned out to be a very wonderful experience for all of the children, and they were all quite young. Well, they were under 15. So it was a terrific idea to do that. And as for the casket, my mother loved homemade things. She loved to make her own things, and she found beauty in that. And so while she was very ill, I don't know if you would remember that we came to your office and looked at the funerals. My mother was Elsie Dick from Morris. That's a long time ago. And then when she did pass away, we had this all arranged, and you delivered it to the church, and she looked so beautiful in there, and we could tell that she was a very happy woman, just like she had always been. So I would say it's worth all of the effort and all of the time. We still have very good memories about it. And as for being in her body, she waited till she could be buried beside my dad. And so there were the two of them. And then later on, my brother Roger Dick, he died, and so he was cremated, and he's on top. But it's sort of very nice to have the family.
Thank you. Let's go to the front here.
The conversation reminded me of an incident when I was very young, and my much older brother lost his wife. And thereafter, for some time, he had a band around his arm, sewn onto his suit jacket and onto his shirts, which he wore, I don't know, for a whole year or a part of a year. I don't see that anymore, and I'm wondering whether that kind of, is there something current that people do or that would be good to do? It doesn't have to be that, it can be something else, but I'm just wondering whether you might comment on that.
But I think that's a great idea. I'm very interested in the power of ritualized grieving, and just like a reminder of a visual symbol that not only for you, but for other people, that there's something different, there's something that's marked you. I think let's reclaim it. Is that a thing I can say here?
One of the pieces that came up in our planning conversation for this event was what is really compelling, I found, was that our worship used to begin with death. And where that was coming from was that in cathedrals we have altars with relics in them. And we literally gather around a symbol, and even the dead are at the center. And the comment was you don't have resurrection without death at some point. And so some of our Christian traditions have moved away completely from bringing death into the center. But I think it's really striking that the very presence, like a relic in an altar is a pretty big deal. Like they don't move that quickly away from that structure. And so what's going on there in terms of marking death in a particular way that we're kind of straying away from that? Let's go back to the floor here.
Hi, I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. I'm a nurse in an emergency room, and so I see death of all spectrums. Am I making feedback come out of this? Can I?
You're okay.
Okay. Earlier this week I had, I actually feel like the honor and privilege of attending to a patient who had a stillborn child. And that's not a good day for her and her husband. But I knew that they were brought to me for a reason, because that is something that I feel comfortable with. She didn't want to hold her baby, and I encouraged her to, because I find that discomfort is a form of the beginning of growth. When we're uncomfortable, we make a change, or we grow, or we get better. I want to thank Tommy for making everybody feel uncomfortable. That was so, I don't want to use the term brave because that term is used too much. That was such a gift of his vulnerability to us, to keep that idea in our hearts, that is something that happens to people. I often am in situations with patients who I know they're going to die and they don't know it yet, or their family doesn't know it yet. And we're going in to tell them that, this is not something we can operate on. This is not something we can fix. And it makes things very uncomfortable. And then I do my best to give them comfort without taking the value of their discomfort away. Doug, my question for you, do you think that it's insensitive for me to do that to people? To go in and tell them, everybody dies. Today is your lucky day, or, this is the day for you, or what can we talk about to make this feel more normal for you? Is that insensitive, or I guess I could ask everybody, if someone said that to you, would you be thankful that there was an honesty about it, or is it more comfortable to use those euphemisms of?
Yeah, I won't say it's your lucky day.
No, well, no, I never say it. I maybe think it. I don't say it.
But no, I think that I appreciated what you said, is the discomfort is the precursor to growth. I mean, it creates the possibility for the kind of transformation that we're looking for. Those are difficult discussions. I mean, and people respond in many different ways. So again, there's no formula as to what you say and do. You deal with people where they are. And often the first thing they're going to have is shock. and it doesn't matter what you say or do, then it's just all washing through. And so often silence is the best speech in there. But in this sense of enabling people to look as honestly as they can bear at the facts that are before them. And if they can do that, they can hang on to hope too. But you just hold these in tension. Go ahead.
Can I ask, it's often the elderly patients that I get to actually have a talk with before they pass or before their spouse passes. And sometimes I kind of give them a rundown of, like, physically, this is what you're going to see in the next hours. Because it's when you see someone breathe and stop breathing and then breathe again and then stop breathing, and the gurgles and the reflexes and, the physical stuff that's not pretty. I would assume for myself, when my dad passed away, I wish that somebody would have given me a heads up on that. But it's hard sometimes to know, is this that kind of crowd that wants that? Do you have any advice on how to get an inkling from someone if it's a good idea to go there?
I think nurses are always sharing medical information with patients and families, and you can do this quite naturally in the course of your work. You can do it kindly. I think people are well advised to know something about what to expect. And those gurgling things, you can come in with your syringes and help to lessen them. And that's what kind of thing I was referring to when I said that it's for the families rather than for the patients. But yeah, my bias is in favor as much truth as a person can bear.
Thank you. I'm going to turn a question to Michael. The death narratives in film and television, does this show an emerging desire to talk about death, or is it a new form of denial?
I think it's an underlying desire to talk about death. I mean, I think we're just displacing conversations that should be happening. I mean, so many of my responses, my totally unprofessional counseling-y advice, answers to some of the questions are like, have a conversation. Like, if you talk about wishes, if we are careful with our language, if we're not hiding our language, if we're not finding euphemistic language to talk around issues, but rather talk about them, I think we come to a greater understanding. Same with these stories. I think we're displacing stories we want to talk to each other about. What does it mean when I die? Because we all do it. What does it mean to grieve? Where do I go when I die? Let's speculate about that. I think it's a deep desire to talk about this stuff.
I'm going to go to the mic here and then to the back. So, sorry.
Good evening. I want to just tell a little miracle story. I grew up in a woodwork shop, and way back in the middle of the last century, and perhaps a bit earlier, my dad used to build coffins, and just now and then, and I remember seeing them when I was a kid, and the jigs for the angles, were hanging on the wall. So in 1972, when my father passed away, my sister said, "Boys, you got to build your dad's coffin." And so she's a pretty strong woman, and we said yes. So I designed it, and my older brothers, who were carpenters, proceeded to build it, and I helped a wee bit as well. The backstory is that two of my brothers, the two good carpenters, had a falling out over business years back, and they hadn't really talked to each other for perhaps, I don't remember, 8-10 years, which always put a damper on any family gatherings we had. Anyway, they worked on this coffin, And so it was hanging in the shop, right in my dad's shop, hanging to dry. It was March. Excuse me. So one evening, I thought, where are my brothers? And I went to the shop, and I saw them talking. And, well, to make a long story short, I beat out of I didn't stay. I figured something's happening. They were reconciled while building their dad's coffin. So that's a bit of warmth.
Thank you. Let's go to the back. We have just a couple minutes. If you've got a pressing question, you can also talk to our panelists after the event. Thank you for your patience.
No problem. I think traditionally most of us have gone to funerals in churches with sermons and traditional church music. But in the last few years, my husband and I have attended many funerals that are not being held in traditional venues. We've been to the Human Rights Museum, we've been to the Qualico Center where they had a stand-up cocktail reception with yam fries and pickerel. Because this was this fellow's favorite food. We've been to St. Charles Country Club. We've been to Celebrations Dinner Theater venue where they had the fellow's favorite soup. Again, many of these have opted not to have sermons, no pastor present at all, and no traditional music. It's been more popular music or music that was very important to the person who passed away. So I'm wondering if there's a move in the recently to go towards this type of funeral and moving away from the religious funeral. Because I've heard people say this is really nice, like this, don't need to attend a funeral where a pastor gets up and talks for 20 minutes. I want to hear about the person who's passed away. So I'm just wondering if this is becoming more and more common.
A comment from someone on the panel? It's maybe just a hunch or a sense, or if there's a trend there.
I think I still tend to see the folks are doing it a little more traditionally because they're either buying a casket or at least an urn from me. But even for those who come into my shop, there are already people who are thinking slightly outside the box, pardon the pun.
That's a classic right there.
You're not the first people to hear it. But so they are thinking creatively about these things, but they're also thinking, I think, still about some kind of an authentic experience that reflects both the grief and the celebration of life and so on.
Our time is coming to a close here. I want to ask our panelists for just one brief takeaway, or if you could leave us with one thought or sentiment to do that, and then I just want to share a brief comment as we come to a close here. And thank you to all of you for submitting questions, those of you online. There's so much wonderful conversation that's still waiting to happen. Let's start with Michael and then work our way back here.
I guess my takeaway is meeting and hearing such interesting stories. I love stories. That's why I study English and film studies. And to appreciate the complex narratives that are always at play with death, whether it's the death of an elderly parent or a child or the way the person died, there are complex narratives that have to be understood and have to be talked about.
I just am really aware of being in a room full of a lot of compassionate people, and I think Tom's story really brought that to the surface. And just sort of, again, how talking about this thing brings us together as people in a way that so few other topics can.
I guess I'm impressed by how much diversity there is now in practices and expectations, and I think our society's we're in a big upheaval. I mean, there's growing dissatisfaction with the funeral industry and growing interest in greener, more down-home sort of ways, and I think it's a helpful corrective. And the Human Rights Museum or wherever it is, there's a lot of things going on. It's in flux. Maybe a new normal will emerge in the decades ahead, but it ain't here yet.
Death is a sad thing, but as my friend Bill Block suggested, good things can happen around losses, and if people actually face them together.
I want to end with just one anecdote. There's been a number of staff here at CMU that have been very close to death in the last several weeks. And one of them, Lois Nickel, sent this to me earlier today, and I'll try to get through this. I just think it's a beautiful picture. She started journaling after the death of her sister a couple months ago, and just came back today from the funeral of her father. And she was just noting few sentences each day of learning things that she's learning. And I just want to share the most recent one from what would have been a couple days ago. At the side of the dead body, one becomes privy to some very private moments between the loved ones of the deceased. Watching my mother touch my dad, and earlier my sister, and whisper endearments to him amidst tears and sobs, using a tone of voice I rarely hear her use, was heartbreaking, but also so holy. I felt I was witnessing one of the most intimate acts a human is part of, saying goodbye to the person they invested 63 years of their life into. I think there's some holy moments available to us, and I thank you for participating in one of those this evening. So thank you for coming. Thank you for investing in the conversation. And I trust that as you go from here, you will live well, because we've understood a little bit more of how to die. Can we thank our panelists, please? So, wish you well. Somebody said we've talked a lot about the elderly and the sick dying, but you may walk out the door and die as well. I hope that's not your situation, but it is a possibility. I don't know how you end this conversation other than facing reality. Drive safely and live well. Good night.